how is a new president, having accreted to himself vast executive powers, going to divest himself, if he is willing, of those powers so that we get back to the ideal situation that Don Watson was talking about?
Thank you.
Will it happen? Is it likely to happen in our lifetime?
In America.
In America.
Yep.
It's an excellent question. If you distill it down to this basic, as I distill it down to this basic idea, which is there has been an enormous executive power grab in the United States. And the one thing I have not heard anybody running for office saying is that they would like to roll back the executive power. People don't do that. It's much easier to erode checks and balances than it is to reinstate them. And that's the danger, I think, that we face in terms of this legacy. I can't imagine that Barack Obama is going to want to clip his own wings. He may not want to torture people or to run indefinite detention centers or anything else, but to actually roll back an idea of an executive power that's been given to a president is not given to people who are thinking, who knows what I'm going to want or need, and who knows how people are going to try and clip my wings in a time of crisis as it is. Let me keep what there is. And I think that's a big problem. I think you've identified what is the biggest challenge that we face, that a very, very, very sound system of checks and balances that has certainly been abused in the past has been eroded, damaged, threatened, pushed against very, very hard by people who had a theory, not just that we should have torture, but that we should actually have an executive privilege for the president in time of war that's virtually unchecked, that a president should be as close to above the law as you can say when it's defined by law. And I worry that it's very hard to imagine. Who wants to run for president on the grounds that as soon as I become president, I will diminish my powers? It's just not in the nature of the game. So that's certainly something we're up against, and it means that we have to have an active Supreme Court, and an active, which, by the way, the Supreme Court, which put the bum in power 8 years ago, has been about the only thing around, even though they're on his side generally, that has clipped his wings. And if we have a Congress that isn't dominated by the same party, and even has a little bit of a majority against it, there's some hope that Congress could perform those checks. But when it's all lined up as a one-party state, it doesn't work.
Two quick questions. Is it because of the armaments industry that America always seems to want to have enemies such as Cuba or some of the leftist South American countries or Iraq? And the other one is, when Americans commit atrocities such as My Lai or other atrocities, why won't they recognise the international court and hand over their citizens? And why have an international court if the most powerful nation won't hand their citizens over who commit those atrocities?
Thank you. Who wants to tackle that one? Don's passing the mic again.
Absurd. I feel like I've become some sort of, the cursed dinner guest. And tell me, in your country, why do you bind their feet and kill their children? I don't think it's because of the armaments industry that we have an enemy like Cuba. There was a communist revolution in Cuba, and at one point, 45, 6, 7, 8 years ago, there was an enormous amount of Soviet nuclear activity in Cuba. They brought in tens of thousands of troops and a bunch of missiles aimed. So we have an enemy in Cuba right now, and I don't think that the armament industry is wasting a whole lot of energy worrying about a place where they barely have anything that can fly or drive. It's not a country that I think America feels threatened by anymore. There's a certain amount of political advantage in Latin America to anti-imperialist rhetoric, and not just in Latin America, elsewhere in the world. America's a very convenient thing to wag your finger at when you're looking to consolidate power. It's good to have a common enemy, right? So America makes a very convenient common enemy for somebody trying to mobilize, whether on certain kinds of right or certain kinds of left in different countries. When I say the right, I mean somebody like Bashir in Sudan I do not think of as a leftist. But it's great for him to invite us to try and solve his problems, and he'll welcome us to the gates of hell. Come on in. The fiery doors are open. As far as, your second question, which is why the United States doesn't respect the International Criminal Court, it's the same reason that the countries in Europe that do respect the International Criminal Court don't have armies that do anything. I'm serious. They expect us to solve the world's problems. Do you remember when Bill Clinton started being in power and he sent over somebody on a listening tour of Europe to find out what to do about Bosnia? And all these European foreign ministers were sitting there wide-eyed going, what do you mean? What are we supposed to do? You tell us. And he said, well, I'm here to listen. You're European powers. This is in Europe's backyard. And they're like, yeah, you see what happens when we try to solve our own problems? We'll be at each other's throats. You're America. You come in, you solve the problem, and then we'll bitch about it. And we'll protest, and we'll throw things at your embassy, and you solve the problem now. But when, you know, and the guy came home with it kind of in shock. Like, they didn't want to talk. I came to listen. They want us to tell them what to do. Now, they don't mind the ICC because their people aren't going to end up in front of it. But I can tell you that there are African countries and smaller countries around the world who see the ICC as entirely a tool of the powerful against the weak. That it is only a system that is going to end up taking a random Rwandan, a random Sudanese, a random Congolese. The Americans aren't going to do it. In My Lai, we actually brought people to justice ourselves. It was our press that exposed it. In other countries, they put the press in jail for that sort of thing. It was our press that exposed it. I don't think that an international criminal court is something that America is going to respect, and this is not necessarily 100% my own view, because we're never going to surrender that much sovereignty. We make other people do that. And I think that other people see the International Criminal Court that way. That they don't say, oh, isn't it great, you know, we're gonna catch Rumsfeld in Brussels. No, you're not. Because we'll withdraw NATO from Brussels in 5 minutes. And Brussels doesn't want that. So they drop the charges. So the world's more complicated than that. There's power at play. And I think that what's happens is real powers say, no, 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 we're not going to subject ourselves to your legal system. And then powers that have to feel that the whole thing is imperial, which is what you get in the showcase trials at, say, Slobodan Milosevic, railing against the violation of his sovereignty. Americans very much resent the idea that we're electing the president of the world. In other words, and McCain is trying to work against this. In other words, when McCain mocks Obama for having drawn a large crowd in Germany, we all understand why he's mocking him. Like, who cares what the Germans think? We're electing the president of the United States. We're discussing healthcare policy here and oil prices. Like, so Germans like you. Whoopee-doo. You know, you got 200,000 Germans to stand in a large crowd and shout. Worked really well last time that happened, you know? Well, it's a problem. You know, I think that there's a point there. I don't think that you would feel that if everybody at LAX that you saw there was suddenly about to vote in the Australian, you'd be, what the hell do they care? I mean, like, am I really supposed to listen to them? And that's that gets to this sort of tension. You know, do we want to be the big power in the world? You certainly don't want to not be the big power in the world anymore and be the ex-big power in the world. That's no good. But at the same time, you don't imagine the world that way. That said, there are a lot of us, I think, for whom part of the appeal of Obama from the very beginning has been that in a single stroke, it seems that there is a way of signaling to the world that this has been a bad patch. We took a wrong turn. The nation got hijacked somehow. Not hijacked. I mean, I think the big pain of the 2000 election was that George W. Bush was not legitimately elected, and the far greater pain, though less obviously expressed, of the 2004 election was that he was legitimately reelected. And that was shocking to a lot of us. I covered that election, and I simply went into a kind of profound political depression afterwards, and withdrew from covering domestic politics for quite a while. And I think that what you're talking about is real. I think that the significance historically of this is really vast. When I mentioned earlier the idea that you have a huge white electorate in Georgia who's voting for him, one of the fascinating things in this election was watching Hillary Clinton become the candidate of the Archie Bunker vote. And how weird that must have been for her and Bill. For her and Bill, he had projected himself in Toni Morrison's phrase as the first black president, But leaving that aside, for people who had come out of like the late 60s idealism, who had seen themselves as progressive idealists, the Kennedy mantle was theirs, not Obama's, for them to suddenly have to retreat towards what are called white ethnic, usually meaning Catholic, Polish, German, or Scotch-Irish, in the Northeast and Ohio. And it's interesting that the North in our country has always been seen as the sort of more egalitarian and liberated part of the country, and the South has always been seen as the redneck and racist part of the country. But guess what the North doesn't have? Rural black populations. You have blacks in the cities, but you don't have that. And in the South, guess what they have? Long history of racism and long history of races. They know each other. They meet each other. When I met people, I grew up in the Northeast, and I knew exactly why she was having this constituency in New England and in Boston and this area of the country, because you have a kind of class resentment and race resentment without the countervailing aspect of actual integration that would require you to make friends and date and mix and know the people who you are able to resent because they remain foreign. And so it becomes the Northeast, which was the home of emancipation and of the whole movement for the abolition of slavery, becomes the last bastion of a certain kind of troglodyte racism in our country. It's not non-existent in the South, and there are parts of the South where it's pretty profound. Obama represents something pretty incredible. When you looked at this speech today, I don't know how many of you actually got to catch it, but there's one of those corny American bioepics that goes beforehand, the little videos, you know, Bill Clinton pioneered the Man from Hope and Reagan had his. And this one was very heavily about, oh, here's my grandmother and here's my grandfather. And you suddenly see these white people from Kansas, right? And one of them was basically Rosie the Riveter. She worked in a boat building factory during the war. And the other one enlisted and fought in Patton's army and helped liberate Dachau. And then they went home, and they're the most sort of middle of the road, middle class, middle American white folks. And then you see him on the south side of Chicago, playing basketball with his new brother-in-law and having this black family. And you think, man, this is something extraordinary. And it's something that a lot of people know. He went straight at the social issues that have been known as the big divisive issues of Karl Rove's republicanism: gods, guns, and gays. He addressed the three of them in order. He said, we may disagree about abortion, but we can agree that we want to diminish the number of unwanted pregnancies. He said, we may disagree on aspects of gun control, but we can all agree that there's absolutely no reason that AK-47s should be available to the hands of criminals. And he said, we can disagree about gay marriage, or we can be unsure about gay marriage, but we can all agree that our gay brothers, sisters, friends, family members should have the right to visit their partners in the hospital. And there's not much there that a Republican can disagree with on the points of agreement that he invented there. And this is what is the difference between him and Jesse Jackson too. Jesse Jackson was a race man. He was all about, I mean, Hillary in her speech yesterday seemed more to me like a Jesse Jackson figure, or 2 days ago, where Hillary Clinton gets up and starts sounding like not the almost one leader of the party, but the leader of a disgruntled faction of female voters. She cast herself that way much more at the end game than she had along the way. But she really put it as like, here I am, the sisterhood of the traveling pantsuits and so forth and so on. And, you know, and this whole thing about I'm going to be the inspiration to your daughters and I'm about your mothers. And she, you know, sensibly never mentioned her husband, but she mentioned her daughter and her mother endlessly. I sort of think her story is that of a great American politician who married badly. And it's been a burden. But she became that. He isn't. He's larger than that. And that's part of his great skill. He has shown a kind of courage. Today he showed a lot of spine that hadn't been there before. And I think he showed something that I know that people on the right are going to play as something that he's really tried to make sure he never did before. He had to avoid being the angry black man. He was very clear about that from the start. There were a lot of places that he would not go as a campaigner. That people were like, come on, hit him, hit her, do it, tell us. And he wouldn't do that. And today he actually showed something in his speech that I found deeply reassuring, which was a kind of indignation about the insult to the American idea of the last 8 years, the insult to the nation. And he showed a kind of spine, and anger might be too strong, but he looked a little pissed off to me in a way that was very appealing, as opposed to in a way that was snappy or snarling or anything else. He looked pissed off because it was an indignation. It was actually an insult to something he cared about. It wasn't personal. And I think that also is something that really harnesses a lot of feeling.
Well, I would like to ask this question of Philip. I don't want to cut you out, but
Please.
it's interesting, isn't it? Isn't it the case that if Joe Biden was the presidential candidate, not the vice presidential candidate, he'd have a lead of about 15 or 20%? And if that's the case, that is a good, safe Democrat candidate. That was so ironic that you had a black candidate and a woman candidate front running, both of whom are highly problematic. It says something terrifically good about the United States, it seems to me, that in a way democracy has thrown up a high-risk candidate when at a time when it should have thrown up a really low-risk candidate who'd bolt in.
Final comments, please, Philip.
Joe Biden got about 3% of the vote in Iowa and dropped out. He did run.
I know.
So I don't know. I don't think he'd be 15% ahead. No, I think that a good vice president is often somebody who adds something to the ticket without ever being conceivable as a front runner. He could be conceivable as a president, but not as a candidate at this point. And that's I don't know how to explain that difference, but I think you know what I mean. And oddly, people felt that Dick Cheney contributed that when he appointed himself vice president 8 years ago. But I mean, in other words, you never thought, oh, this guy could lead the ticket.
Well, a good, safe white man is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that people, I was not one of the people. I would raise my hand and say, I would not have said Barack Obama will win. I thought if the thing works, he would win, and he's certainly plausible. He's simply a more skilled, more interesting politician than we've had in a very, very long time. And he's articulated something. Now, whether he'll be a good president, my own jury is out. If he gets elected, I don't want to have to sit around and say, like I said, he was going to be a great president. I said he's an incredibly gifted candidate. And part of that may be that we don't entirely know what we're getting into. He doesn't carry that baggage. He allows him, because he doesn't have all this baggage, he's in a position to articulate an idea that he brings together. He's saying a lot of stuff that a lot of people have felt and not put their finger on. He's not contradicting something he said in the past. He talks about change, and he actually is something new in a certain way. He comes at it without all the baggage of race politics, black or white. In some odd way, he is slightly post-racial. He's cut all the old race politicians off at their knees. He, shows up with these beautiful black kids and these white grandparents. Check it out, So he's not simply a black guy. I mean, he's an American amalgam. And remember, he is one of the people to whom the phrase African American fits appropriately. His father is Kenyan. He's also an immigrant story, and he is also brilliant. The fact is, I first heard about him because I had a friend who's one of these guys who sits at home and trades stocks, and had done pretty well. But he'd met his neighbor across the street in Brooklyn, who was a guy who'd gone to law school with Obama, and was part of what is now emerging as a group of people who are black American captains of finance and law from the last 15 to 20 years, who had their radar onto this guy early on because he represented something that they were living, which was an integrated society. Look at Condoleezza Rice. Condoleezza Rice is obviously very taken with him. She has gone out of her way to make it clear that she thinks he'd be an excellent president, which is really interesting. Colin Powell, same. These are Republicans. He is a conservative in many ways, and he's been explicit about that, both in philosophy and in practice and in temperament. That's important. He's appealed to Republicans from the start. There were Republicans from Obama from almost before the first primaries. So it's just a very interesting place. And the idea that a safe white guy, yeah, sure, but there isn't one. What we wanted was somebody who could light some fire and who could actually tell us about ourselves in some way that didn't sound like the same old BS. And I think that is his greatest strength, and his difficulty will be delivering on it if he gets elected, because it's a tough job.
These United States, please thank our panel.